Wonderful. Well, it's good to see you on this April afternoon to review the scintillating, fascinating, so exciting topic of church bylaws. And in order to do that, we need to pray. So please join me in prayer. Oh, holy and gracious God, through your word, we know that in the beginning there was nothing except chaos, and your breath, your spirit hovered over the chaos. And you know that ever since then, humanity has done everything we can to make order out of chaos. And sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good to know how to be together, to have the things that guide us, the things that give us the lines within which we operate for mission and ministry. And sometimes it's just plain necessary in order to function in this world as it is in these days. So be with us as we talk about this necessary thing, the bylaws for our congregations. Keep our minds clear as we touch on some of the legal language that is necessary, and also help remind us over and over again that even these things that are legal documents, they are meant to point us towards you, point us to mission, point us to vision, point us to faithfulness. So help us weave that into the corporation pieces that we're required to have. We know you can do that. So we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hope you can all see that. Bylaws for the congregation. Woo! So this presentation will also be available on the website as a PDF, so you do not need to write everything down. In fact, I urge you don't do that. Uh, I want to start by looking really quickly, because there's a lot here, but I want us to at least be aware of what our Book of Order says when it comes to these legal pieces. So, first and foremost, hopefully this isn't a surprise, that any incorporation and bylaws documents must conform to our Constitution. And if there are places where our bylaws or our articles of incorporation or our administrative manual, which I'll touch on briefly, if there's any place where those things are in conflict with our Constitution, it is our Constitution that takes precedence. So if there is something in your bylaws that, for instance, we all know a ruling elder can serve for up to 6 years and then must take a year off. If you have put in your bylaws that elders can serve for 10 years, well, our Constitution takes priority. And so that piece of your bylaws is actually not effective. So, Constitution, we get to check it back and forth. One of the pieces of our bylaws is congregations providing by rule the quorum necessary to conduct business. And when you see that language, congregations shall provide, that points to bylaws. If it says sessions shall provide, then that's different. But when it's the congregation that is required to provide by rule or to set language or quorum, that is something that should be in our bylaws. So that is speaking about congregational meetings. Congregations, again, congregations shall provide by their own rule minimum notification requirements. Again, that's something that should be in your bylaws. Is it 2 Sundays? Is it consecutive Sundays? All that stuff. Whenever permitted by civil law, both ecclesiastical and corporate business may be conducted at the same congregational meeting. So some congregations may have a habit of separating the corporate pieces which may be electing trustees for the corporation. They may separate that from the rest of the congregational meeting, which would include the pastor's terms of call if the pastor is installed. We don't have to do that in the states of Delaware or Maryland. In both states, the elders on session are able to serve as the trustees, and so both ecclesiastical and corporate business can be accomplished at the same time. You don't have to adjourn one meeting to go into another meeting. We do have to do that at the presbytery level because our membership is a different thing. And so that's one of the places where what you see the presbytery do does not equal what a congregation should do. So we can do them both. We do not have to have separate meetings. A congregation, by majority vote, may choose not to utilize the ordered ministry of deacons. So this is one of those places where the bylaws of a congregation may or may not indicate the use of a board of deacons. I'll say a little bit more about that, but again, that's a congregational level decision. Congregations may provide by their own rule, see that language, for a congregational nominating committee. And then there's very specific guidelines in our Book of Order. So how is the nominating committee elected? That needs to be in the bylaws of the congregation. These next pieces, ruling elders, deacons shall be elected to serve terms of no more than 3 years, may be eligible for re-election according to congregational rule. That's where you can get into the weeds a little bit, where you can do 6 years, but if you do an unexpired term of 1 year and then you're elected to a 3-year term, you may or may not have a rule that allows somebody to be elected then to a 2-year term for a total of 6. That's some of the minutia that would be in a congregation's bylaws. Every council shall develop procedures and mechanisms for promoting and reviewing that body's implementation of the church's commitment to inclusiveness and representation. So council in the congregation's sense is the session. So here we see that while there is a shall develop procedures and mechanisms, this is at the session level to create guidelines for how a commitment to inclusiveness and representation is carried out by the congregation's nominating committee. So council equals session. Each council shall develop a manual of administrative operations, and I will do another training on that topic. But again, that belongs to the session, not to the congregation. So that could be things like committees, because it is session that establishes committees. They are committees of the session, not committees of the congregation. The only committee of the congregation is the nominating committee. So a manual of administrative operations lays out those kinds of things, that we're going to have these committees and these committees have these functions. This is how we're going to implement inclusivity and be sure of representation, those kinds of things. Councils may designate by their own rule. Oh, that's what I was just saying, such committees and commissions. And again, that would be in the manual of administrative operations. Sessions shall provide by rule for a quorum of meetings. So your bylaws should not, must not actually, because it'd be in conflict with our Book of Order. Your bylaws must not set quorum for session. The bylaws are for the congregation. They set quorum for a congregational meeting. The session has the authority to set its own quorum. And the last point on this slide, also, session may provide by rule for standard financial practices. So whatever financial procedures that you follow in your church, those go into a manual of administrative operations and not into the bylaws. So there's a little, fine line between what goes in one and what goes in the other. But if you hold on to where the authority rests, in a congregation, the session approves the budget, and so the session would set financial management guidelines. The congregation may approve the pastor, and so guidelines around how a pastor is called would be in the congregation's bylaws. And we have a whole chapter on the church and civil authority. And so this just makes clear who has the right to vote, only persons eligible for membership, and who may be elected as trustees. Ruling elders on the session who are eligible under civil law shall be the trustees of the corporation, unless the corporation shall determine another method for electing its trustees. So some congregations decide that they prefer to have a separate board of trustees that is elected separately from the session. That's a corporation decision. That would be in the bylaws. It's not necessary in either Delaware or Maryland. Like I said, both states allow our sessions to fulfill the role of trustees. But even if a congregation does provide in its bylaws for a separate board of elected trustees, the Book of Order is really very clear that the work of the trustees is under the supervision of the session, that the session is the final authority in the church. And so if your bylaws give ultimate authority on any matter to a separate board of trustees, that would be in conflict with the Book of Order, and the Book of Order would take precedence. Whew, that's a really fast overview. Like I said, you'll get this PDF along with some sample bylaws from me as a resource, and they'll be posted on the website. So let's dig into actual bylaws. So I pulled up a couple of different sample bylaws. There's a sample bylaw from the PCUSA, and that's what I have pulled this language from a sample available on the PCUSA website. The Presbytery of Baltimore has a sample as well, which for our congregations in Maryland is a good additional guide if there's specific language that Maryland requires. And I also have pulled up a bylaws template for the state of Delaware. But by and large, the PCUSA template that we're going to go through has everything we need. It is possible to have more in your bylaws than you will see in the template. Because again, you may have made decisions at the congregational level that rise to the level of a bylaws decision that may not be found here. But here's the sample. To start out with our statement of purpose or mission, that one of the reasons for bylaws in any organization is to state clearly the reason for that organization's existence. Our reason for existence is because we've been called by God and organized to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. It is a Christocentric, clear statement of mission in the church. And that's appropriate, even though it is a civil document. Our mission is religious. And so that language can flow through our bylaws, even though they are filed at the state level. We always want to state our relationship in our bylaws. And in our case, you are a Presbyterian church that is a member church of Newcastle Presbytery in the Synod of the Mid-Atlantic of the Presbyterian Church USA. And so that sets out for civil reasons, for legal reasons, where you are responsibly located. One of the things that does is it clearly says to the civil authorities that as a religious institution, you fall under the guidelines of the PCUSA, under our Constitution. Um, and so in places where the PCUSA's Constitution may be in conflict with the Constitution of the United States of America, the PCUSA Constitution in those cases has precedence because that is the governing body that you are a part of. So it's very important in one of the first articles in your bylaws to have that kind of language. Some churches go further. Some churches include when they were founded, the date of their chartering. They include their physical location, not necessarily an address, but what city they're located in. And some go into more detail here. It's not necessary, but it's not wrong. Oh, this language about the governance of the church is really important to have. This or something like it. The church shall be governed in accordance with the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church USA. So that follows. You've stated where your membership is, where you are held as a corporation. This then makes really clear Constitution of the Presbyterian Church USA and Robert's Rules of Order, because that is what we use for our parliamentary guidance. So saying this in your bylaws means that you have said clearly that session meetings and congregational meetings will be moderated in a fashion that is consistent with Robert's Rules of Order. It also makes it clear that the Constitution of the PCUSA is the presiding, the precedent-setting document for everything that we say and do. Okay, then we start getting into the details. Meetings of the church. So this is one of the places where churches have the space to make decisions. This is sample language. There shall be an annual meeting of the congregation. That's pretty normal. Some churches will specify when that annual meeting happens. And so that language is in italics, usually in the first month after the close of the fiscal year, or usually in the first quarter of the calendar year. Some churches have their annual meetings in the fall, or they will have two different required stated meetings, one to elect new officers in the fall, and one to review annual reports in the early spring or early in the new year. Those kinds of details are appropriate for the bylaws, specifying when the congregation meets in a stated way, how often that happens, and what the purpose is. So that kind of information, which you see in this sample, is something that you would find in the bylaws. And you see some of those reasons. Annual report, financial report, changes in terms of call, nominating committee, electing. And then it also specifies how any special meetings may be called. And that's an important thing to have in the bylaws because it touches on the congregation. The manner in which a special meeting of the congregation may be called should be included in the bylaws. And you might need a special meeting in order to call a new pastor or to dissolve a pastoral relationship at the end of that chapter of ministry. You may need a special meeting in order to make decisions around real property, because property decisions in terms of selling, leasing, or encumbering, like mortgaging or getting a line of credit, those are congregation decisions. So you have to have some guidance in how a special meeting is called. Usually, as you see in the sample, a special meeting is called by the session. And per Robert's Rules of Order, as well as our Constitution, when a special meeting is called, the purpose has to be clearly stated. Business shall be restricted to that which is specified in the call. Notice. So we touched on that in the Book of Order requirements. The bylaws need to specify how notice is given for all congregational meetings, both the stated ones, like the annual meeting or the election meeting, as well as any special meetings. And you see the Book of Order citation there, that there's a rule for minimum notification. I will say, and I saw this in some of the church samples, I do not recommend putting in the actual Book of Order citations in your bylaws, because if those citations change, if a paragraph is added and all the numbering changes, you have to go through a bylaws change in order to do that. And most of us don't remember that we've got those citations, and so we actually don't go back. You may remember that a new form of government was adopted, gosh, 2010, 2012, with very different numbering. And I suspect there are churches all across the PCUSA whose bylaws may still have numbering, Book of Order citations, based on a numbering system that doesn't exist anymore. So you don't have to cite it. You do not have to put the citation in your bylaws. You can simply say, per the Constitution of the PCUSA or per the Book of Order, and then whatever follows afterwards. Pretty standard is 2 successive Sundays. Now sometimes we're having congregational meetings on Zoom, and that is one of the things you would want to specify in your bylaws. And so I do recommend, if you have not done this yet, if you're in the process of checking out your bylaws, if you want to be able to have the opportunity for a hybrid congregational meeting with people both physically in person and joining electronically, or the opportunity to have a congregational meeting fully electronically, that should be specified in your bylaws under format of meeting or place of meeting. Most of our churches didn't have anything like that when the pandemic started. And my advice was to sin boldly, because, yeah, that's where we all were. But going forward, now that we can meet and review and make changes to our bylaws, I do recommend putting in something about the ability to have electronic meetings at the congregational level. For the session, that would be in that Manual of Administrative Operations. Also, the bylaws should have some language about who can serve as moderator, who can serve as secretary, and how the minutes are taken. Now, all of those things are clearly spelled out in the Book of Order. So those pieces could be very short. Per the Book of Order, or the moderator will be determined per the guidelines of the Book of Order. I don't think anything more is necessary. Most of the bylaws samples have that language then embedded, but that's redundant. The one piece around minutes that you may consider including in your bylaws is how the minutes of congregational meetings are approved. Because if you have one annual congregational meeting, typically the body that assembled for the meeting is the body that approves the minutes of that meeting, unless you have another mechanism in place in your bylaws. So if you don't specify in your bylaws, it would mean that part of your annual congregational meeting is approving the minutes of the previous year's annual congregational meeting. So I do recommend having discussions about what is a different way to do that. One possibility is to provide in your bylaws that, for example, the minutes of the congregational meeting shall be posted for review and comment for a month or 4 Sundays after the meeting adjourns, after which the session has the authority to approve those minutes. Something like that. And that's permissible as long as it's in your bylaws. So if it's not in your bylaws, it is the congregation's responsibility to approve the minutes of congregational meetings. Okay, quorum. Like we saw in the Book of Order citations, the quorum for a congregational meeting shall be established in the bylaws of the congregation. I recommend using a percentage and not a number, because if you say no fewer than 20 and 19 people are there, you do not have a quorum, and any business you undertake is out of order. A percentage is a little more forgiving because, we round people up. No half people in percentage world. So there's a little more forgiveness. But it is the congregation's right to set whether it's a number or a quorum of members, which is another reason to keep an eye on your membership rolls. That's another side conversation, but if you are carrying a high number of people on your membership rolls who are no longer active in the ministry and mission of the congregation, that impacts your quorum for congregational meetings. So, something to keep in mind. Now, in the state of Maryland, there's additional language that's required that you see there about active members on corporate matters, and also in the state of Maryland, only active members 18 years or older may vote on corporate matters. That's probably true in Delaware as well. I didn't get far enough in my research to check that out. And that's simply because that is the age of majority. And matters of the corporation are financial and property related. And so if you are voting to take out a mortgage on the property in order to do some repair or do some remodeling, legally, if you're under the age of 18, you don't have the right to make that decision because you are considered a minor by law. So that makes sense. But it's something to keep an eye on. The congregations I've served have intentionally elected and ordained elders who were in high school. And so many times those elders would not be old enough to legally vote on these kinds of property or financial related decisions. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be part of the session, but they may not serve as a trustee. All right. Quorum for meeting. All right. Incorporation. All of our churches should be incorporated. If you don't know, you should be able to find your incorporation papers either through the county or the state. Some of our churches are really old, so those papers may need to be redrawn. But we do, in the Presbyterian Church, we believe very strongly that we're called to be good citizens in our country, that we're called to be part of the public good, and that includes incorporating. And so you see this language around incorporation and moderating around corporate matters. Again, in Delaware and Maryland, we are not required to split off corporate matters from ecclesial matters, because for our purposes, they are one and the same, that the corporation is the body of Christ. In some states, there are requirements that those things be split off. So that language would not be necessary unless the congregation wanted to do that. That would be an option. Nominating committee. This is a really important part of our congregation's bylaws. First of all, setting how large the nominating committee is. There should be at least 3. And it is appropriate and possible to set a range. No fewer than 3, no more than 6, or if the congregation is larger, maybe no more than 9. That's a pretty big nominating committee. 3 is small and is the smallest possible. Most congregations that I've served or worked with have had around 5 or 6 people on the nominating committee. One shall be a ruling elder currently serving on the session. You may or may not specify that it should be a ruling elder whose term is ending. That's a common practice, that a ruling elder whose term is ending is expected to serve on the nominating committee. You see here that it is not required that the ruling elder chair the committee. You could put that in the bylaws. If it was important to the congregation that the nominating committee be chaired by an active elder on session, you could put that in the bylaws. It's not necessary. Most congregations follow that practice. Pastors shall be member ex officio without vote. That's in our book of order. It's good to include here because that's one of the places where sometimes we get confused. But pastors are ex officio members of our nominating committees with voice, but without vote. Any active member may make nominations from the floor. That's both Book of Order and Robert's Rules of Order. So it just puts that in the bylaws. A majority of all active members present and voting. So this is where we set what is the threshold in order to be elected. We use majority, which is again Robert's Rules, most of the time. On some matters, we set a supermajority, 2/3 of those active, present and voting. Majority is sufficient, but a congregation may choose to set a different threshold level. I will point out the language present is really important, and we'll see that later in the bylaws presentation here, but there is no voting by proxy. We don't mail in ballots because we believe really, really strongly that the Spirit moves in the gathered body. So making arrangements for people to attend meetings electronically at the same time with as equal as possible access can be a way to expand engagement and involvement, but you have to be present, physically or digitally, in order to vote. You can't vote in advance. You can't vote after the fact. The vote happens when the body is gathered, and that is an essential piece of our polity. Then in our bylaws, we need to have language about our boards. And for us, that is elders on the session, deacons, if a congregation chooses to use them, trustees, and a separate board of trustees if a congregation decides to use them. In all three cases, some of this language will be the same. So, first of all, establishing the number. How many? How many elders, deacons, trustees? Again, I recommend using a range. No more than 9, 12, depends on the size of your congregation and your need. No less than 3. You need 3 elders to make a session. Setting a range gives you some flexibility. First of all, if you have a hard time getting some people for a couple of years, you're not out of order with your bylaws. So if you in your bylaws state the congregation shall have 9 elders on session, and yeah, you're kind of squeaking by with 7, and that continues on, that actually opens the church up for a remedial action because you are out of order with your bylaws. Is that going to happen? Probably not. But still, if it did happen, I'd be the one helping you, and I don't want to. So I do recommend a range, no less than 3, but then set what the top number should be based on your congregation. And that way you've got that flexibility. If you've got 6 elders and then there's somebody who just has fantastic gifts, and you know that having that person on your session for the next few years is going to be just such a boon to the mission and ministry of the congregation, you've got the flexibility to add another elder without having to go back to the bylaws. The language about consecutive terms, aggregating more than 6 years, it's in our book of order, but helpful to have in the bylaws. The Sabbath year is also helpful language. This language around electing a clerk of session, forming committees as necessary, electing a treasurer, all of that is in our book of order. Including it in the bylaws ties it together. So helpful to have, probably not necessary, but it does communicate at the state level how the congregation is governed. So the state has access to this in ways that the state might not have access to or understanding of our book of order. And as you see, that last sentence, setting the quorum. I did say before that it's the session's responsibility to set the quorum, and I stand by that. A lot of bylaws, church bylaws, include language around quorum. If it came down to it, if there was a complaint about that, the book of order gives that responsibility to the session. So I wouldn't recommend that. I didn't catch it when I copied and pasted. So there you go. Deacons, same kind of thing. If you have deacons, I recommend a range. That same language about length of service, how the deacons are organized, that they elect their own moderator and secretary, that they have the ability to form committees as necessary, the language around the pastor being an advisory member. And then again, in this bylaws sample, it includes language for setting quorum. Same thing as before, that appropriately resides in the board of deacons. So I wouldn't include that in the bylaws. And same thing with trustees. So if your congregation does want to have a separate board of trustees, they can do that. It is helpful, as you see in this sample, to include in your bylaws whether it's the session serving as the trustees or whether it is a separate board. And you see in this sample, the elders in active service on the session who've reached the age of 18 will be the trustees of the corporation. So that is one way to specify who the trustees of the corporation are. And then language around quorum and convening, those kinds of things, how the minutes are happened. So if you do have a separate board of trustees, then having language about how that works for a meeting of the corporation, if you have a separate meeting of the corporation, is appropriate to have in the bylaws, since it is about the meeting of the larger body. Oh, language about vacancies. So if you have a vacancy for elders or deacons or trustees, it's appropriate to have some language in the bylaws about whether those vacancies can be filled anytime. A special meeting may be called, as the session may determine, as you see there, or whether you're only going to elect people once a year. That's not very flexible, but the congregation has the right to make that decision. This last piece, amendments to the bylaws, changes to the bylaws, is an important piece to have. And it's almost always the last paragraph in a bylaws. How can they be amended? 2/3 is the supermajority, and that is appropriate. That is an appropriate level of approval to changes in the bylaws. A simple majority is not appropriate. It needs to be a supermajority. Sometimes our language around amending the bylaws may require advance notice of the changes. This particular sample provides that the proposed changes in printed form shall be distributed at the same time as the call of meeting. I wouldn't recommend requiring that anything be in printed form. So you don't have to specify how it's distributed. Anything you specify in your bylaws becomes binding. So if you specify that printed forms shall be distributed, that means you have to mail or physically hand every member that information when the meeting's called. Most of us do all of that by email now. So to simply say, providing that the proposed changes shall have been distributed. See, it's a slight difference, but it's a telling difference. Shall have been distributed at the same time as the call of meeting. You can require a greater window of information for a special meeting, that any changes to the bylaws need to be shared 4 weeks ahead of the meeting. Keeping in mind that any window, any requirement you put in then has to be abided by. Most bylaws have wiggle room language, which is not an official term, but that's the language that says any portion of these bylaws may be suspended at a properly called meeting with a 2/3 vote. And where that can be important is around the amendments. I have seen some amendments requirements that require first and second readings, and there isn't time. There may not be time. There may be a change that needs to happen more quickly. And so having that wiggle room language that allows you to suspend that portion of the bylaws requiring a first and second reading by a 2/3 vote gives you that space in case there is an urgent matter that needs attention. It shouldn't be used willy-nilly. It shouldn't be used just any time for anything, but having some flexibility can be really helpful. Whew. That was a lot. I wasn't sure I'd get through it, but I did. And I talked a little fast. Um, any questions? A lot that I threw at you. Like I said, this presentation, I'll go back and fix the places where I said, that's not actually supposed to be in the bylaws. I'll go back and fix that. So the posted presentation will be clearer. And I'll also post the sample bylaws from Delaware and the state of Maryland. So those are available. But any questions, anything that came up for you that you might be wondering about? And yeah.
Take that off. I'm on mute. As you were doing this presentation, I just today received a copy of our bylaws. And every item in the bylaw has a book of order number associated with it. And I'm thinking, my gosh, we gotta go back and take. Is it acceptable to just go back and take them out? And would that require a vote?
I would say that taking them out completely would require a vote. If you are
Every one
able,
of these has it in there.
yeah. And so that could be a simple, I mean, that could be a simple vote to move that the bylaws be amended to remove direct book of order citations. And that would cover all of them. You wouldn't need a separate vote for each of them.
Okay.
If, you know, in the meantime, if you were able to, if you wanted to,
Check them
go
all.
check
You're
them
going to
all.
say.
If, I mean, that would just be an edit to make sure that it's G101A and not G101B. That is just an edit, and it doesn't change anything material. But removing the citations, which I think is a good idea, I do recommend that. That would be a more significant change, and that's something the congregation should approve.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Sorry.
Well, that's all right.
But good for you for getting a copy. I have talked with some pastors and clerks of sessions, and they're like, I have no idea. And that's okay. It's not the end of the world. You are doing mission and ministry without bylaws. There's some things that may be a little out of order, but Peter didn't have bylaws for the church in Jerusalem. I can promise you that. It'll be okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Ruth.
With the elders serving as trustees, does that mean that when you elect president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer for the trustees, they should all be current elders?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's one thing.
Yeah.
We also our bylaws on the amendment section currently has a list of such and such, article such and such, line such and such cannot be changed. And I'm like, what, are you crazy?
Yeah, no.
I mean, like last year, we ended up having to change the quorum for the meetings because the quorum was set when there were twice as many people in the church as there are now.
Yeah.
And I had to first put in a change to the amendment section that said this section could not be changed.
Wow.
And then we could vote on, once we voted on that, we could then vote on the change of the quorum.
Yeah, it's not appropriate to
Okay.
to
Well, that's good. That's good to know, because I'm about to work on putting in the Zoom and hybrid meetings and that kind of stuff. And to put it in a logical place would change all these numbers.
Yeah.
So I'll be happy to take that out.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that we always need to keep in mind, whether it's congregational bylaws or a manual of administrative operations at the session level. the current body, the current corporation cannot tie the hands of the future body. So it's not appropriate to say in the bylaws, these things can't be changed because the world changes, and trying to control something that in 10, 15, 20, 50 years may mean nothing. Um, that's not helpful. It's not healthy, and it's also not decent or in order.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Well, if you think of any, or if as you are discovering your bylaws and going through them or recreating them, which is fine, please don't hesitate to reach out. It is one of the reasons why for this year's minutes review, I'm asking people to bring a copy of their bylaws. We'd like to have them at the Presbytery office for our information. But also, I've had a lot of questions over the last year. What can be, what should be, what shouldn't be. So we're just gonna try to tighten that up. So we're all in good shape on this administrative level, which is important. So next month, our May training, time of equipping, is going to be the fourth Wednesday. The 26th of May, May 26th, and we're going to have special guests. So one of the things we are intending to shift to at the presbytery level is to begin receiving per capita and mission giving electronically. We we're going to try to streamline things. And we have a really good system in place. And our treasurer, Jerry Hunter, and the incomparable Donna Scully worked with one of our, yeah, woohoo! I think it's exciting. Worked with one of our churches who was feeling really frustrated. Their checks weren't arriving. So they were saying, we paid that. And the presbytery office is saying, not according to us. So the easiest answer was to set up the online giving because it doesn't get lost in the mail, it doesn't get misdelivered somewhere. And so they did that with one church, kind of saw where the kinks were, have worked out the kinks, and are going to start rolling it out. So, May 26th, Donna and Jerry are going to take over my time and talk about the program and talk about how it works, answer questions, walk through the specifics, and give you a heads up. Our intention, our goal is by January 2023, all of our churches will be remitting electronically. If there is, for some reason, a significant hurdle, then we'll work with that church. But most banks allow online bill pay, which is what we would be. We would be an online bill. So we believe that this will be helpful for all of our congregations. It'll be much easier for bookkeeping. It'll streamline the office. Donna won't have to open all the checks and do all the stuff, all the pieces. Anyway, so May 26th, 5 p.m., that again will be recorded. I will be sending out a reminder because we especially want to also invite any treasurers or financial secretaries who deal with those things. So for our clerks of session and pastors, this is good information, but we also want to bring in some of the people who will be dealing directly with the change and the process going forward. So with that said, thank you. Thank you for joining in. I'm going to